Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. It's 12:17 by my clock, so thank you very much for joining us. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the Academic Director at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, and it is my pleasure to be your host today for the Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Seminar focused on industrial ecology of the green transition, evaluating material options. And this is one of a series that we've had this spring focusing on the challenges that are posed for energy and energy transitions by metals, minerals, and materials, and how the importance of recognizing those challenges as we seek to forge new pathways towards sustainable energy futures ahead. I'm really pleased to welcome Michael Cox as our guest moderator today. Michael is a professor of environmental studies here at Dartmouth College, and he is the co-chair of the PhD program here in ecology, evolution, environment, and society. He's also co-founder and co-host of a really interesting podcast, the In Common podcast, which I encourage you to check out. And his research and teaching at Dartmouth is in environmental governance, natural resource management. So with that, I will hand the mic over to Michael to introduce our speaker, and then we will get going. Michael, over to you.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So it is, in turn, my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Professor Saleem Ali, who is the chair of the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences at the University of Delaware, where he also directs the Minerals, Materials, and Society program. He is also honorary professor at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland, Australia, and a senior fellow at Columbia University's Center on Sustainable Investment. Professor Ali's books include Earthly Order, How Natural Laws Define Human Life by Oxford University Press, and Treasures of the Earth, Need, Greed, and a Sustainable Future, published by Yale University Press. Dr. Ali is also a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel and the Scientific and Technical Advisor Panel of the Global Environmental Facility, or GEF, a multilateral trust fund that supports environmental treaties around the world. When Amanda reached out to me to moderate this session, I was really excited about the opportunity to hear Dr. Ali talk about this subject. My own kind of origin story, which I won't go into very much at all, is very much has to do with issues of circular economies and just this dissonance that I think a lot of us have with just the idea of throwing something away when we know that it's not really away, even though we're throwing it, even if we throw it fairly far from us. And I appreciated in the abstract for this talk that it mentioned the polarized policy debates that often accompany discussions of green energy and green energy transitions and infrastructure. And I certainly agree that these debates often get very polarized. And I think this is one of the main challenges that we have to overcome in promoting transitions to more green energy economies. And I think one of the ways in which we address this challenge of polarization is with discussions like the one that we're going to have today, that challenges some of our assumptions, adopts a systems perspective to really force us to deal with just how complex the world is. And when we're forced to do that, I think that really challenges some of the assumptions associated with a certain position that we've taken within our own group, and a kind of mentality of thinking, well, you're with us or you're against us in terms of, say, the green energy transition or not. And I think that's an ongoing challenge for us all to face. And so I'm looking forward to unpacking complexity with the talk today. And so with that, Professor Ali, I'll say the floor, I guess the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Cox. It's wonderful to reconnect with colleagues at Dartmouth. I visited your campus frequently when I used to live in Vermont. I was a professor at UVM for 10 years. And so I have many fond memories of your neck of the woods. So I'm going to try and breeze through this in about half an hour, and then hopefully we can have some robust discussion. In terms of, first of all, considering the role of materials and energy, let's just put up some facts up front. This is from a diagram that I'm working on actually for a paper we're preparing, and it's under second review with a notable journal. And I wanted to make sure that we have this conversation up front, that when, there's no free lunch in the universe. There is always going to be this material energy trade-off in terms of how we're going to be able to harness the resources that we're talking about. And my first degree was in chemistry, so I started off in the natural sciences, and then I moved more and more towards the applied social sciences. But I really see myself as a system scientist in terms of how I look at these issues. So, if you think about the material energy nexus with reference to power generation, considering, of course, that solar power is very much important and part of the mix we want, but the material needs needed for solar power are by far the highest. And that makes sense because, you need that kind of infrastructure to be able to have the physical spatial area to harness the power. And this diagram is showing you what kind of materials. You need a lot of steel, and you do need glass, a lot of that. And then there are all these other materials, and that's where some of the critical metals may come in too. Because in the case of solar power, you need cadmium telluride, perhaps, you may need indium, you may need a lot of exotic metals. In the case of hydropower, you need a lot of concrete. So there's the big concrete gray bar there. With wind, there's also a lot of concrete, especially for offshore wind. And in Delaware, we have a Center for Research in Wind, one of the leading research centers in wind power in the country. So we, really looked into this lots of different ways. And we have certainly steel and all this other stuff. Geothermal, still very material intensive, but less so than the others. And then you get at these ones, which are often pariah technologies as far as our environmental sensibilities are concerned. But the material needs are considerably less, even for nuclear, which requires a lot of concrete with reference to safety needs of the conventional reactors, is still much less. And so, we're dealing with this challenge of the material needs. And then there's another aspect of this, which I haven't put up front, but you may be familiar with the concept of energy density that people like Václav Smil and others have highlighted admirably. And that becomes even more challenging in terms of then the fuel that you're using. And, the energy density clearly for materials like nuclear is much higher than for some of the conventional renewable energy sources. So that's kind of where we are at. Now, when it comes to these materials, and especially the metals, I'm going to talk a lot about the metals because there are these other materials too. We talked about concrete and, there's glass, which is needed also, but silicon is, silicates, which are used in glass, are fairly abundant. So we're not going to talk as much about that. The sand mining is another problem, which is, in fact, from an environmental point of view, another emerging area, and a lot of new papers published in Science and other venerable venues about that recently. But I am going to focus on metals because we don't have enough time. I have worked on some of the other minerals also. So when we think about technology metals, these are some of the ways we can delineate their access. We have terrestrial mining regions with competing human use, right? You have terrestrial mining regions where there isn't human use. So you might not have agriculture, but you have biodiversity. So you might be going into pristine areas where those metals are found. You have coastal mining underwater in some cases, but not in the deep sea. So these would be like, for example, there's diamond mining off the coast of Namibia. We haven't had too much metallic mining in continental shelf, though there have been some projects which were initially started. But we could do that. Then there's coastal mining underwater, but within national waters. That could happen in terms of the exclusive economic zone that's within 200 miles of the shores of the country, according to the law of the sea convention. And I'm going to talk about especially also oceanic mining, which is deep sea mining in international waters, which has become very controversial also and is linked to the green energy transition. And so that is different because that is actually happening in the deep sea, which is governed currently under the International Seabed Authority, that's part of the Law of the Sea Convention. This is an entity that was set up by the United Nations. It's based in Jamaica, and it's in the process of looking at mineral licenses for extraction in the deep sea. And then finally, which is probably the most preferred source, is recycled metal stocks. But the challenge with recycled metal stocks is you first have to have enough stocks to be able to recycle. And then you also have this other conundrum with recycling that if you really want to have very durable products, then you don't have recycling stocks. So there's a trade-off. If you increase the life of a product, you reduce its recyclability turnover. And so you're in this constant treadmill situation. So you have to figure out an optimal outcome where possible with that. Now I'm using the paradigm of industrial ecology. I am sure Dartmouth has some course on industrial ecology, but for those of you who may not know about industrial ecology, it's a term that was coined about maybe 3 decades ago. I feel very fortunate that I took the first course that was ever offered in industrial ecology in 1994 when I was doing my master's degree at Yale. And it was taught by Brad Allenby and Tom Gradle, who wrote the first textbook on industrial ecology. The industrial ecology paradigm, as the name suggests, is that industry is part of the ecological system. It's sort of in congruence with the concept of the Anthropocene, that now humans have made this indelible impact on the planet, and that industrial systems are part of the natural system now. And so we have to find ways in terms of biomimicry or linking industrial cycles to natural cycles or finding ways in that sense. And you use the same kind of metaphors like metabolism and symbiosis and all, which you might use from natural systems in industrial ecology. And it's an established field now. You have the Journal of Industrial Ecology, you have the Society of Industrial Ecology, you've got Gordon conferences, which NSF organizes on industrial ecology. So it's established. But this diagram gives you a kind of sense of how industrial ecologists think about the material nexus. You know, you've got the flows, you're always looking for flows and how and where they go. You have dematerialization strategies. You always want to reduce the amount of material without compromising quality. So always finding that's the engineering role. You have to then think about reduction, recycling, resource efficiency options. That's something which we have looked at a lot at the UN, at the International Resource Panel. A lot of our work is around resource efficiency issues. But being aware that efficiency can lead to what we call a rebound effect, or Jevons paradox, as it's called, which is that if you cause a lot of efficiency, if you have latent demand, you can still increase consumption. That's what we've seen with hybrid cars, where people started driving more because they thought they were saving on gas and being good, but they ended up driving more than they otherwise would. And that's a rebound effect. So you have to be careful about the efficiency trade-off. And then you have the chemical aspect of how you are processing the materials and looking at that. And we have metrics within industrial ecology. We have methods which we can use to make those comparisons. And one of those methods I'm going to talk about later. Now, zooming out, minerals on the planet, biodiversity, I mentioned, is an important metric in this regard. So this is some work we did a few years ago, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, where we looked at mining and biodiversity. And other important trade-off which we have to consider. And so what this is showing you is you've got all these different mineral projects that are being considered for some of these technology metals, like copper, nickel, and so on, and where they're located in terms of higher biodiversity ecosystems. So what we find is there is definitely a coincidence of mineral deposits and advanced exploration in high biodiversity ecosystems. right? So that's another part of the trade-off. Now, if we think about reserves, so in economic geology, there are two terms we use, reserve and resource. Resource is what is out there in terms of the Earth's crust. So we know, like, for example, the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, not on the planet itself, but on the crust of the Earth, is aluminum, right? But so you've got a lot of aluminum, but that resource of aluminum will become a reserve if it is economically extractable. So we're talking here about so these are the two terms in the column, is reserve-based and resource-based. Reserve-based is what is now considered with current technologies to be economically extractable. And the resource is the total amount that geologists will tell you is out there. And this is where we get into the situation with rare earths, and people always love to say, oh, rare earths are not really rare. Well, yes, they are not really rare if you think about a resource. But when you think about a reserve, meaning whether it's economically viable to extract them, I would say, yes, they are rare. So people love to do these kind of counterfactuals, like, oh yeah, no, this is not right and all. But you have to think of it in the big picture, and the reserve and the resource tells you. So here, what it's telling you is now we're looking at deep sea mining versus terrestrial mining. So in industrial ecology, when you're trying to compare impacts, you try to see what are the different kinds of metrics we can use. So here we've got the CCZ is the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. That is the part of the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and Mexico where deep sea mining may occur, because you have these very concentrated deposits of polymetallic nodules at the bottom of the deep sea. And they were deposited through very interesting precipitation processes, but so they've led to this natural concentration of an ore right there. Okay, so that's where this is comparing what the resource base there is of these nodules and the terrestrial reserve base compare. Now, whether this resource base becomes a reserve will be dependent on whether deep sea mining is arguably economically viable or not. And the argument is being made that now it will be in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe 5 years. Okay. So this is basically showing you all these different metals we're talking about all across. But the ones which are most significant in comparing the deep sea and the terrestrial are manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt particularly. Okay, but all these others are useful in other ways for these various resources which are listed here. Now, life cycle analysis is a tool which we use in industrial ecology to compare the impacts. And what it essentially does is it looks at different metrics you can use, whether it is waste generation, carbon footprint, biodiversity impacts, even social impacts. You can do a social LCA as well, right? So here you've got an example from a paper we published in the Journal of Cleaner Production in 2020 of how you might do a life cycle analysis for comparing the different ore bodies for these battery metals, which we need for the green energy transition. So we know that, nickel, cobalt, manganese are all very important for batteries, and batteries are going to be absolutely essential if we're going to have a green energy transition, because if we need baseload power from renewables like solar and wind, you need batteries. If you don't have, you cannot have baseload power from solar and wind without batteries of some kind. And this is the real challenge. That's where the battery technology, it's not just for electric cars, but it's for actually having the grid functional. Otherwise, you will need some other source. Most likely, we've had fossil fuels or nuclear, which has provided the baseload power. So this is looking at that dynamic. You're looking at the collection where it's mined, the processing, refining, and for each step, we look at the impacts, right? That's what a life cycle analysis does, cradle to cradle, looking at those impacts, or cradle to grave if you're actually disposing them. So this is the result we got for doing a life cycle analysis impact of terrestrial versus deep sea mining of these green energy metals that we need for batteries, especially, right? So we looked at land ores and nodules, those nodules I was telling you about in the deep sea. And what we found was surprising, and it was especially contrary to what we are hearing in the mainstream media, which is that there is a lot of concern about deep sea mining. But if you actually look at the ecological impact from this perspective, from the carbon footprint, this is looking at the carbon footprint, it's much less for deep sea mining. And in some ways it makes sense because the ore is concentrated, right? So you don't have to dig up a lot of earth to get at the ore, and you also don't have to process it as much. So the carbon footprint is reduced at all of these different steps. And so that's what we got. And we did a detailed sensitivity analysis and so on as well. The other aspect of this is the tailings. And when you mine materials and you refine them, you get a lot of this finely grained waste material that we call tailings. And you may have heard about some of these terrible disasters like the one in Brazil, where there were two in Brazil actually, which in the last 5 years, where you had these tailings dams, which had been accumulating all of this waste over years, which suddenly burst. And in one case, you had, major loss of life, and a town was completely buried under these tailings. So the other thing we were looking at is like, how can you reduce tailings with deep sea mining? So clearly with deep sea mining, because the ore is so concentrated and you're able to do a lot of the hydrometallurgical work instead of the hydrometallurgical work that you do with some of the conventional minerals, you are doing this kind of pyrometallurgical work for the processing. You get much less in terms of tailings, okay? So hydrometallurgical, as the term suggests, is through use of water and chemicals, and pyrometallurgical involves more combustion processes and so on. So that's another important part. Another paper then we just published a few months ago, and this is now online with Journal of Industrial Ecology. We looked at the waste impact. We looked at the carbon footprint from life cycle analysis. Then we looked at the waste impact between the two. So the tailings work as well as the waste rock comparison between deep sea mining and terrestrial mining. And what we found again here was that the waste impacts were much less also. So both waste and carbon footprint from an industrial ecology life cycle analysis, deep sea mining comes out better than terrestrial mining, okay? And then what we had left with is biodiversity. And that's the really difficult one. That's where you've got a lot of the controversial aspects, and the environmentalists are absolutely right that the biodiversity in the deep sea, we don't know a lot about it, right? And there are some very unique species. Even the origin of life, I'm sure, you know, Michael's evolutionary biologists and all in the cohort will attest to the importance of the archaea ecosystems in the deep sea, where we believe life probably originated. So it is very special. So what we did there was, and this is a work in progress, the biodiversity life cycle analysis is very difficult to do because it is highly subjective. But we are trying to do it, even for biodiversity. So this is what we're doing: primary research, construction of indices of biodiversity data, and then we're looking at the policy comparison options, right? And these are some of the biodiversity concerns. First of all, it is important to differentiate polymetallic nodule ecosystems from hydrothermal vents, which is what you see in the wonderful National Geographic documentaries with black smokers and these beautiful worms and, you know, giant organisms that you wouldn't imagine, beautiful colored system. That is the hydrothermal vents of an active system. That's not where the mining is being proposed. The primary mining being proposed is in the polymetallic nodules, where you don't have the hydrothermal vents. That's where you have these deposits, these concentrated manganese, nickel, copper, cobalt ores. So that's what we first of all wanted to look at. So we had to then look at the, you know, the fight. First of all, important that in the deep sea there is no plant life, because there's no light reaching that part of the sea. So there's no phytodiversity at all. But there is really interesting faunal diversity, especially microbial diversity, which is what we're looking at. So this is just to give you a sense of the way in which we're approaching this issue. Is, you know, we're looking at it from the point of view of species diversity in terms of the acreage, and we're comparing it to what is going on in terms of the Clarion-Clipperton zone and where this mining is proposed. And it's a tricky area because, quality is not the same as quantity. And you have to think about how you differentiate those aspects of species quality and how important they are in terms of their role in ecosystem functioning and so on. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at all of those aspects of their role in the carbon cycle and so on. And that's going to be an important part of the conversation in terms of making suggestions on whether deep sea mining makes sense or not. Okay. Now, finally, just to wrap things up a bit, all of this, when it comes to decision making, for how, if we want to make the green energy transition and we want to meet the Paris Agreement targets, we have a time-sensitive situation. One of the arguments for deep sea mining is that if we don't resource these metals fast enough, we will not be able to have the green energy transition fast enough to meet those deadlines that have been given to us by the IPCC in terms of thresholds for irreversible tipping points of climate impact, right? And so then you have, on the one hand, you have the geoengineering enthusiasts who are like, oh, it's, if we don't do geoengineering, this will happen. On the other hand, you have people who say, well, geoengineering is even too drastic. Why don't we think about resourcing metals to make the green energy transition, which is what is being proposed here? So then in the midst of all this is risk, right? How do you deal with risk? Because you have risk of climate change, you have risk of these technologies, the risk of biodiversity in the deep sea. And we often use this precautionary principle, right? This is enshrined in the 1992 Agenda 21 from the Earth Summit. When I was an undergraduate student, I remember the precautionary principle in 92, and this was a big deal. And we had, but precautionary principle, mind you, much as our dear friends in the environmental movement use this, is not a scientific principle. It's a principle for decision-making, which needs to be unpacked, right? Otherwise, it's a recipe for disaster, because if you take the precautionary principle to the extreme, you would have no vaccination, you would have no field testing of anything, because they would be too scared to take a risk, right? So it needs to be unpacked. And so basically, IUCN, the World Conservation Union, or the International Union for Conservation of Nature, they came up with the whole process of how you do science-based decision-making around the precautionary principle. And that's what, it's a very useful guide. You can look it up online. And what they try to do is, they try to look at it from the point of view of what kind of operational trade-offs do you have, right? So the precautionary principle cannot be taken in isolation. It has to be taken in the context of a system with trade-offs. And that's how we need to operationalize. And that's what we're trying to do with the LCA approach. So when people talk about a moratorium, right? Often environmentalists invoke the precautionary principle to call for a moratorium on one thing or another. You could have moratorium on GMO technology, moratorium on CRISPR, moratorium on gene drive technologies was proposed in the conventional biological diversity. Now there's moratorium on deep sea mining, moratorium on geoengineering. Okay, so we have to then think about how do we make that decision on moratorium? I have made the argument that, for example, I have supported a moratorium on solar radiation management because it is so drastic and it is not even clear that it is going to have the required impact. And it presents an important moral hazard problem in terms of then how people will possibly not make changes that they need to. So there's a case for a moratorium on SRM based on the trade-off analysis. But there is not as much a case for a moratorium on deep sea mining, at least the way I see it from the data we have. Because even the biodiversity assessments would be a constant dynamic process as the mining proceeds. And there is, in fact, a governance mechanism to ensure that there is constant vigilance of that at the international level. So that's the argument. Whereas for SRM, there is no international governance mechanism. We don't have an international solar management authority like we have the International Seabed Authority. So that's how I try to then dice out and make those decisions. I'm trained as a planner. So I want to make, I don't just theorize. I want to find solutions and make things work. So that's how I try to think through it. Ultimately, this is the goal, a circular economy trajectory. If we have enough stocks of these metals, we definitely need to make a circular economy argument. And what I find really interesting with the deep sea mining industry is that that's the argument they're making. A lot of them are saying, there's a company called the Metals Company, and they've had scientists, some of their scientists have been co-authors on our paper because they've collected the data. And what they have made the argument is that once they have enough metal stocks for batteries for cobalt, nickel, and manganese, they will stop mining in the deep sea and go to a completely circular model. And that's where they'll make their money. Because with deep sea mining battery metals, batteries, once you have enough stock, they are eminently recyclable, right? So the good news with them is once you have enough stock of the batteries, you can get very easy recycling, but you have to have enough stock. The average battery is going to last 10 years in a hybrid vehicle, maybe the same in a smart grid situation. And we have to have that stock first to be able to recycle. So, and there's this notion of a blockchain record, so you can actually track and see where those battery metals came from and make that case as well for more responsible sourcing. Part of the challenge that's been presented around it is that currently a lot of the metals are coming from illegal sources. And so we have to, this can also be a way to make the, a more clean supply chain. Another way to think about a life cycle analysis is using the SDGs. So this is one where the SDGs can be used as metrics, the Sustainable Development Goals and the indicators which come from them. And these are some of the SDGs which could be used for technology metals and comparing these different sources as well, especially with reference to SDG 12 on responsible production and consumption. But that can be another measure. If you go into the details of the SDGs, they do have indicators, which you can then use for the LCA. The other thing which is very important and reason, I spent a lot of my career, especially when I was in Australia, I directed a center on social responsibility in mining. We have a big challenge with social conflicts around mining. So one of the other aspects of the social LCA, the reason why the case for deep sea mining for me makes some plausible sense, cautiously, not to just dive in gung-ho, is that the amount of conflict with terrestrial mining is so great because people are often being displaced. You have compensation problems, you have environmental and social impacts, you have child labor. You don't have any of those problems with the deep sea issue. So this is from a paper we published in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy, where we looked at the cost of conflict in mining. It's huge. There are countries which have banned mining currently. El Salvador has banned mining. You have several jurisdictions in countries like Argentina which have banned mining. So you have the social problems. And you have to then think about the trade-off also with the social problems. In Australia, we had just last year, Rio Tinto, they desecrated a 40,000-year-old sacred site of Aboriginal people with terrestrial mining that was not being done very responsibly. So you don't have these problems with deep sea mining. You have the biodiversity, but you don't have that. Again, trade-offs, no free lunch in the universe. So one of the things we've also argued for finally is that we need a kind of a model where we have a better conversation between demand and supply of metals, especially technology metals. So this is a model we developed with some colleagues at Columbia, and it's called the SMED, the Smart Mineral Enterprise Development Model. And what we're arguing there is ultimately you need to connect the public and private sectors, and you need the black boxes are the public-private partnerships. So how you would make this happen. One of the problems we have is new technologies are developed, you have new exotic metals being used, and you often do not have the requisite exchange between these ideas to get the demand and the supply to meet. Developing a new mine takes 10 to 15 years. So if you do not have that conversation between supply and demand, you will have a disconnect. And you will get these bottlenecks, supply shortages, and that way you will delay the green transition. So we developed this model. You're welcome to read the paper. It was published in Energy Research and Social Science around this issue. So that's the goal of this is, and you bring in the recycling entrepreneurs, you bring in all these different aspects. You have the role of LCA also noted, you have stock exchange. We also talk about stockpiles. There should be a strategic stockpiles of different metals. We used to have them during the Cold War. But we don't have much. We have petroleum stockpile and we have few other things, but not as much as we should be having for some of these big technology metal needs in the long run as well. So it talks about like having this integrated model of having supply and demand communicating better. Finally, just a quick plug on the book that was mentioned by Michael. My book, which is coming out in July, it's just ready for release, and I'll actually put the in the chat. I will put the link also if anyone wants to pre-order. There is a discount available from Oxford University Press. I wrote this book partly to deal with these kinds of challenges. This book is, it's a culmination of several years of teaching sustainability and trying to figure out for a general audience, what do we need as foundational knowledge for people to move from environmental awareness to environmental literacy? Because a lot of the books that are written and a lot of our courses, I feel, they don't get to the foundational knowledge that's really needed in complex systems. And the book tries to make that connection, especially with reference to the material energy nexus. And so I hope that this will be also helpful in dealing with some of these issues, but also dealing with much broader issues of dealing with suboptimality, of these issues of trade-offs, how you make decisions. And that's kind of the reason why I put this together. And another commitment from me with this book is I'm donating all of the net royalties for environmental literacy programs, because I feel that we're at a stage right now where we have a lot, we had like health literacy a century ago and it transformed things. We currently do not have environmental literacy. I do not consider Greta Thunberg to be, providing environmental literacy. I think she's doing a great service in providing environmental awareness, but we need a much deeper learning, which is going to help people understand trade-offs. Because right now they can't understand trade-offs, so they end up in conflicts. They get polarized. I think if we do this with this level of rigor, we will end up in a much better space for the future. So I'll stop there. I guess the last slide is just to give you some plugs for our program at University of Delaware. We're state university. We don't have the same prestige branding as Dartmouth, but we do a lot of good work. And we now have an alumnus who's in the White House. So at least we've got some branding there. So thanks so much. Michael, over to you to moderate the questions.
Great, thanks, Saleem. That was really interesting. Okay, so there's a couple questions that I was also sent earlier. So I think I'm actually going to start with one of them. So what are the implications of deep sea mining for how we're actually viewing renewable energy? Is it misleading at that point to call it renewable energy, given that the precursors that we need to build the infrastructure are effectively non-renewable? And does that matter? Does that phraseology and whether it's misleading matter? And you're muted right now, Saleem, sorry.
Yes, so, the question of renewability, I find that as someone who's trained as a chemist, I find this term perplexing at times. First of all, you have to think about at what time scale are we talking about renewability? And we have to also think about that material energy nexus, right? So if at one level, when we talk about resources, metals as non-renewable, that's not accurate from a chemical perspective, really, because metals are actually infinitely renewable in the context of Earth systems, as long as you can invest energy to get them out. The only way you convert one element into another is you have a nuclear reaction. Otherwise, the copper that you mined, it's 2,000 years ago, it's out there somewhere on the roof of a church. It's just turned to copper oxide, and we have to figure out a way to put energy to get the copper out, right? So the concept of renewability from a systems perspective needs to be better understood. That's what I mean by foundational knowledge. You talk to the average Joe Schmo environmental studies students and they'll throw this renewability, but they don't get to that foundational knowledge. They don't understand entropy. They don't understand exergy. So that's what I try. So that's one part of the problem. So yes, there will be a material energy trade-off, wherever you do it. That's why I showed the first diagram. For solar, you will need it. You will need it, but that's okay. You know, as long as you can find cyclical systems to bring those materials back, uh, you'll be all right. You find energy resources to make that happen, you'll be okay. You just have to figure that out.
So building on that, Saleem, there's another couple of questions about kind of transitions to a more recycling-based economy. When you talk about figuring it out, how do we ensure that, I mean, and this reminds me of concerns I've heard expressed about, that the renewable energy economy might replace Exxon with the next, big wind or something like that, and big solar, the kind of with the specter of these
Yeah.
large multinational corporations that makes some people nervous. Like,
Yeah, yeah. I
so,
mean, there is what they call the climate industrial complex also, right? Which is similar in some ways. I mean, this is the challenge we have. So, you need scale many times. You need economies of scale. And this is also the part of an earthly order. I have a section on economic order. So the first part is natural order, economic order, and then political order. We look at the whole spectrum of order. And certainly in the case of economics, there are economies of scale. And so in capitalist systems, when you have economies of scale, you end up getting these multinational corporations. And you will get that with almost anything. I mean, you look at it with Ben and Jerry's in Vermont nearby to you, ultimately it was bought by Unilever and it became all of these, even the small ones, they end up because to have impact at scale, they will need to do that. So the same is happening with solar energy, with the wind, everything, it gets ultimately upscaled if you really want to have that impact. But as long as you can monitor and enforce and you have good compliance, being big is not necessarily bad. You just have to make sure you have accountability. That accountability comes from the mom and pop shop all the way up to a multinational. The problem happens is that when things become too big, many times they get political capture. And because of that political capture, then you cannot have that accountability, right? That's what happened with big oil. That's what happened with big tobacco. That's what could happen with big energy, renewable energy too. And that's where the role of science is so important. The role of advocacy is important. Accountability mechanisms are important. And so scale itself is not bad. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater with reference to scale, but you need the accountability to be concomitant with that scale.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Just to directly follow up, I agree with you that this is an important statement. Like, as long as there's accountability, as long as you have monitoring, enforcement, compliance, a lot of other stuff sorts itself out. In my experience, what that means is that the monitoring and enforcement is the hardest part often. And making sure that there is compliance is the hardest part. It's much easier to kind of write new rules than it is to get folks to enforce them. But I want to, when you think about the role of, say, the mining companies, are we envisioning that the mining companies themselves would play a part in transitioning to a recycling-based economy, or would there be other actors that would kind of take over at that point? How do you incentivize companies that are really, their value proposition is that they're going to pull stuff out of the ground, out of the ocean bed?
Yeah.
Are those the actors that are also then helping transition to a recycling-based economy, or are there other actors that then take over at that point, do you think?
It varies a lot from commodity. And so, for example, aluminum, there is a lot of integration, vertical integration in aluminum, and also recycling is connected within the mining industry. So Alcoa, which is one of the, it's the oldest and one of the largest aluminum producers still in the US as well as globally, they are very much in the recycling business. But copper mining companies, no, not as much. They could be, but they're not. Platinum, I do some training on environmental and social responsibility for Anglo American, which is a major platinum producer. And I told them, it's pathetic that they do not, they should be much more in the recycling business for platinum. Why? What's the biggest user of platinum? Anyone want to venture? It's not jewelry. It's your catalytic converters in your car. So those catalytic converters are highly recyclable and very modular. They should be in the business of recycling catalytic converters to get platinum out of it. It's a very rare metal. And it's going to be needed for the green energy transition. It's going to be needed for hydrogen fuel cells, for what we need for hydrogen, right? So yes, it's a problem. Sometimes there isn't the right incentive. Sometimes there is a cultural problem with some of the companies where they just see themselves as mining companies. I've said to them, in fact, I said, you should be branding yourself as material service providers, not as mining companies. Now, oil industry tried to do that a little bit at one time. You remember the time BP said, BP is not British Petroleum, it's beyond petroleum. And they've said they're getting into renewable energy. But that was a bit of a farce because they really didn't. It was like 5–10% of their business. And then they stopped using that. But I think in the case of mining, there's very good potential for them really becoming material service providers rather than just mining companies.
Okay. So there's another question, and I'll read it, and then I've been thinking about something similar, so I'll kind of piggyback on that. So the question is, how realistic are the plans to rapidly electrify the vehicle fleet? Following up on this, are there enough accessible, economically recoverable materials for this? And this is kind of a specific version of a question I've wondered for a while, and it relates to the discourse on degrowth that questions the assumption that we should ramp up renewable energy to kind of displace fossil fuels, instead arguing that we should actually be doing kind of more with less. That if we try to force renewables to meet what our current energy demands, say by we're totally replacing our vehicle fleet with EVs, that we actually can't afford to do that in certain ways.
Yeah.
So the first question then is, what do you think about, are there some hard limits to kind of scaling up as much as we might assume that we need to? And does that relate to any opinions you would have on this kind of counter movement of degrowth that questions the assumption that scale is what needs to happen to the extent to which we assume it does?
Yes, I mean, you are clearly, the home of the late Dana Meadows and all wonderful limits to growth group. But I have great admiration for that approach at a fundamental level of ethics and so on. However, coming from a developing country originally, from Pakistan, that degrowth will not make sense for developing countries. It makes good sense for developed countries to some degree, where we should be doing more with less. And we have good examples of countries like Japan, where we have different kind of material usage with good quality of life. So in that context, degrowth is fine. But at a planetary level, where you have still 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity, degrowth does not make sense. In fact, we have no example of development from a least developed country to a fully developed country without growth. You need economic growth to do that. So it's the main thing is where you do the degrowth. Degrowth is fine to do in New Hampshire. It is not fine to do in Maharashtra, India, or Sindh, Pakistan. So yes, I'm for it, but just be selective on where you apply it, and don't be sanctimonious about it, which is what often ends up happening with our students when they go out in the world.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, Saleem, do you think that what is the relationship between this is something I think about it in some of the classes I teach, between kind of the intellectualizing that we do on a college campus and kind of having real world experiences and trying to make change happen? What do you think the balance is between those two? And what do you think is missing on one side versus the other?
Well, I mean, I think what is really missing is this this sense of knowing the trade-offs, moving from being idealistic and being realistic and pragmatic. And there's a sense I feel within the environmental movement, almost a kind of nihilism, where there is this, it's everything you are against. And it becomes like the opposition and resistance becomes an end in itself. And I find that very problematic. And I think we need to make sure that our students see the virtue of compromise. They see the virtue of being able to reconcile with suboptimality. Because and this is a very mathematical issue. If you go back to, Amartya Sen, the great Nobel laureate, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on inequality. So he was not one of the, usual Chicago school kind of elite academics who was just focused on esoteric models. He actually looked at famines and looked at situation. One of his lesser known papers is one called The Impossibility of a Paretian Liberal, where he said that, in a liberal society, it is impossible to be Pareto optimal because you are having to balance individual choice. You are having to balance reconciling people's desires in certain cases, which you can inform and educate as much, but there will be suboptimality at some level, right? And so I think getting our students to understand that there are certain fundamental constraints in terms of not being able to have that utopian ideal, that will help them solve problems, whether it's like with nuclear power. I mean, one of the things, one example is, one of the reasons we're stuck in this situation right now is because of the anti-nuclear movement went so much into overdrive that they completely missed the challenge of climate change. And now you have all of the people are telling you one of the reasons we're not meeting the Paris targets is because so many of the nuclear power plants are being phased out ahead of schedule than they thought they would be. Even if you're against nuclear and you don't want to build new nuclear power plants, having the reason why, because we've made it so economically non-viable for them to continue because of a variety of other reasons of pressures that have been put. Because of bad information, bad risk analysis. I asked my students in my class, and I'm not like a gung-ho nuclear guy, I'm just saying practically speaking, look at the data. I asked them, how many people died in the Fukushima disaster from nuclear radiation poisoning? And someone has Googled, immediately Fukushima deaths, 12,000 people. I said 12,000, those people, not one person died of radiation poisoning. Those people died of the tsunami. But if you look at 10 years of data from Fukushima, now the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has done the studies, you have no cancer clusters. If you look at deaths per capita from nuclear, it's far less than most of the other energy sources. But this data is not going to be communicated. So you can have your other concerns about nuclear, but then you have to have the trade-off. You don't have the trade-off, and then you end up with bad decisions. And now we are stuck with them. And now you get the people, they're like, oh, it was never economically viable. Well, it's completely disingenuous when they say that, because they have made it economically unviable.
Okay. I mean,
just an example that this is the problem of our education system and in environmental studies. We don't have good learning, and the faculty themselves have become dogmatic about it. So
dogmatic in the sense of wanting to promote a particular perspective and solution set.
I mean, I am happy to be convinced. If the data tells me something different, I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. We don't have many. We have people who are Nobel laureates who are dogmatic. There are examples of that many times who become that way. And then they have to be, you have to be willing to. It's not just the amount of accolades you have, you're a member of National Academy or MacArthur Fellow, whatever. That doesn't matter. You can still be dogmatic. And we should have the space to be able to push that envelope.
I mean, Saleem, part of this conversation is reminding me of the importance of interdisciplinarity, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And in my own field, we talk about it in a positive way, but it's one of these words that sounds nice, but it's really hard to implement. But I think being interdisciplinary, when we talk about environmental studies, it's part of what I think environmental studies is supposed to be about. And the value of it is that you talked about understanding constraints. And I think it's helpful for different disciplines to understand the different constraints that other disciplines face in doing their work, and that help them understand the constraints that we face in achieving a solution. So you're talking about, there's some biophysical constraints we're talking about. And when you were talking about enforcement and compliance, suddenly as a social scientist, I think about the constraints and having like an effective enforcement and compliance system, right? Who's going to monitor the monitors and all that? Have you thought
Yeah.
much about the role of interdisciplinarity in, say, education about these problems as a way to become less dogmatic?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I personally think, and that's one of the goals of Earthly Order, the book is that it's going back to that notion of comprehensive rationality. You need not just to be taking these courses like we have in our liberal arts curriculum, and I talk about CP Snow and all in the early part of the book about how just in terms of education, it's not like, oh, you have to do these two requirements, this you have to design the curriculum so that it is interwoven. We like in University of Delaware, I teach a course now on earth system science and policy. That course is meant to be intersectional. It's not like I'm just saying, okay, this is the section on policy and this is the section. You have to find that
Mm-hmm.
linkage. And complex systems provides us a very valuable mechanism to think through that, right? How you get emergence and principles of emergence, like the wonderful work of Jeffrey West in his book, Scale, which is about, how you're talking about complex systems at the quantum level all the way to cities. And you have similar processes which permeate that. That kind of foundational learning is really important for our students. That's what provides that kind of interdisciplinarity that's really important. And the other problem we have, and I must be, is our students, and as a social scientist, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, there is a fear factor of the natural sciences. And this leads to the, I mean, we have two majors, environmental studies and environmental science. And why on earth do we have this? The studies people are doing it because, oh, they don't want to take calculus, they don't want to do the natural science, they're afraid. I mean, I think this is a disservice. I don't feel that there are people who simply, we're not talking about doing very, completely unreachable kind of imaginary numbers type of maths. You just have to have basic science background so you understand it. And so I think this is the other problem. Interdisciplinarity has become polarized too. You have the social science interdisciplinary people and you have the natural science interdisciplinary people. And even I don't know how it is at Dartmouth with your the majors now, but this is a big problem because we have the student like, oh, I want a Bachelor of Science or I want a Bachelor of Arts degree. You can't understand natural systems without foundational knowledge about the laws of nature, right?
Well, and if I could jump in, I think that it's hard to understand human systems, right, without understanding some basics about human nature, right? And so I think that
Exactly,
this has been a
exactly.
really fascinating discussion. Michael, I don't want to preclude any concluding remarks that you might have, but I think that we started with materials and we wound up with the philosophy of pedagogy, right, and how we teach and learn about how do we balance the idealism of our students with the recognition of suboptimality. That's one of the pieces that I will take away from this conversation with you, Saleem, and that in itself is provocative in a really positive way. Michael, did you have any closing thoughts before we sign off?
Well, just reflecting on the last couple of things that you said, Salim, I agree that you're kind of reflecting on the importance of kind of true interdisciplinarity. And in my own experience, we often have this kind of baton model where there's a social scientist, they social science, there's a physical scientist, they physical science, and then you just like hand off my results to you or vice versa. There's not a lot of thick understanding of what each other is doing or the constraints we face in doing our work. And that's because it's a lot more work to really internalize someone else's perspectives that they are living with as they do their work. So, and to me, it's ultimately, it's doing the work, it's spending the time with folks that don't have the same perspective as you is the kind of underlying driver of dealing with those barriers.
Absolutely. And, one of the great things at Dartmouth, you still have geography, I think, as a
Yep.
department,
Mm-hmm.
and geography is a discipline that is designed for interdisciplinarity that way, right? And it's a real travesty that so many geography departments in the country atrophied or morphed into something other, and then some other dominant discipline took over, like earth science or something. But it's really important that we maintain that. And I hope your students go to AAG meetings and all, and they'll see the vitality there.
So it's my job at this point to cut off what has been a really interesting and provocative conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Saleem Ali and Professor Michael Cox. I really appreciate the conversation. And Stephanie, thank you for putting up a slide on another couple of events coming up before the end of term here at Dartmouth. So next week on Wednesday, our new energy series of young scholars in energy and society continues with Benedict Probst from ETH Zurich, who will be speaking on carbon offsets, problem or panacea. And then finally on Tuesday, May 31, the last in our series this spring of Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Talks is a talk by Karen Hong Hui, I think is how we pronounce her last name, the last in the series on critical materials, and thinking about how we think about those critically. That will be an in-person and hybrid talk to close us out this spring. Thank you both so much for joining us, and all stay well. Thank you for being here. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye.